Someone you know is going to die. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but at some point, someone close to you will be gone, and you will stand at a graveside or sit in a quiet room and feel something so heavy and so ancient that no amount of modern language will fully capture it. Grief is the most universal human experience after birth. Every person who has ever lived has felt it. And yet, for most of human history, no one talked about it the way we do now. They did something else entirely, and what they did will change how you think about loss forever. The story does not begin with flowers or funerals or 5 stages. It begins in a cave. In 2015, deep inside a cave system in South Africa called the Rising Star Cave, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger and his team made a discovery that stunned the scientific world. They found the remains of a previously unknown human ancestor, Homo naledi, buried in a remote chamber that could only be reached by crawling through a passage barely wide enough for a human body. The chamber showed no evidence of predator activity. There were no signs of flooding that would have washed the bodies in. The only explanation that held up to scrutiny was deliberate placement. These ancient beings, with brains roughly 1/3 the size of yours, had carried their dead deep into the earth and left them there, intentionally. Homo naledi was doing this somewhere between 335,000 and 241,000 years ago. That is staggering, because for a long time scientists assumed that ritual burial, the deliberate symbolic treatment of the dead, was something that appeared late in human evolution, something tied to big brains and complex language, something modern. Berger's discovery forced the entire field to reconsider when the relationship between humans and death actually began. And what it revealed is that the impulse to do something, to not simply walk away from the body of someone you knew, is older and deeper than anyone imagined. But what exactly did ancient humans do? The answer is not one thing. It is many things, spread across hundreds of thousands of years and dozens of different populations. And the more archaeologists piece it together, the more it looks less like a ritual and more like a conversation. A conversation between the living and the dead that humanity has been having since before it was fully human. The earliest confirmed intentional burial of modern Homo sapiens dates to around 130,000 years ago in a site called Khafze Cave in Israel. Archaeologists found the remains of at least 15 individuals arranged carefully, their bodies positioned, some buried with objects. One of the most striking was a child, no more than 12 years old, buried with the antlers of a deer laid across its hands. Someone placed those antlers deliberately. Someone wanted that child to carry something into whatever came next. That act, choosing what to bury alongside the dead, is one of the most human things in the archaeological record. It also tells you something important about what ancient humans believed. They believed in something after. Not necessarily the heaven or the paradise of modern religions, we cannot know that. But the consistent appearance of grave goods across cultures separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years tells us that ancient humans almost universally operated under the assumption that death was not a full stop. It was a transition. The dead needed things. The dead went somewhere. And the living had a responsibility to prepare them for the journey. In Sunghir, Russia, 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried head to head, their bodies covered in more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads arranged in patterns suggesting elaborate fitted clothing. The beads alone would have taken an estimated 10,000 hours to produce. Someone spent more than a year of labor dressing 2 dead children in the finest things their community could make. This was not a quick, functional disposal of remains. This was a society stopping everything to honor 2 of its youngest members. Now think about what that means for the people left behind. Anthropologist Barbara King at the College of William and Mary has argued that grief in non-human primates is a real and observable phenomenon. Chimpanzees have been documented carrying the bodies of their dead infants for days. Elephants return to the bones of their dead and stand over them in what researchers describe as a recognizable mourning behavior. The capacity to grieve, King argues, is not uniquely human, but what humans do with grief is uniquely human. We ritualize it. We give it shape. We build ceremonies around it that transform raw, crushing loss into something that the community can hold together. That is what the burial was for. Not for the dead. The dead do not need the beads. The dead do not need the antlers or the red ochre pigment or the careful positioning of the body facing east. The living need those things. The ritual creates a container for grief. It gives the mourners something to do with their hands, something to organize their attention, a sequence of actions that carries them from the moment of death through to something that feels, however imperfectly, like completion. And this is something that researcher Paul Pettit at Durham University has spent decades documenting in the Paleolithic record. Pettit argues that mortuary behavior, the formal treatment of the dead, was not simply an expression of belief in an afterlife. It was a social technology, a way of managing the crisis that death creates in a small, tightly bonded group. When someone in a group of 50 people dies, the social fabric tears. There is a gap where that person was. The group has to reorganize. Grief, if left unmanaged, can destabilize the entire community. The ritual was the repair. This is why across almost every culture that has ever been studied, the treatment of the dead involves the whole community. It is not a private matter. It never was. The Neanderthals, your evolutionary cousins, a separate species who shared the earth with your ancestors for tens of thousands of years, buried their dead in ways that still generate fierce debate among scientists. At a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologist Ralph Selecki in the 1950s found Neanderthal remains surrounded by concentrated pollen from flowers. He interpreted this as evidence of flower burial, the oldest funeral flowers ever discovered. Later researchers challenged this, suggesting rodents may have brought the pollen in, but other Neanderthal burials carefully excavated and analyzed since do show clear signs of intentional placement, of bodies arranged with apparent care. The debate continues, but the weight of evidence suggests that even before modern humans, something in the ancestral line recognized death as requiring a response. What kind of response? And what does it mean for you? Consider what happened in almost every ancient mortuary tradition that survives in the archaeological record. The body was treated, cleaned, painted, adorned, wrapped. Sometimes it was left on a platform to decompose before the bones were gathered and buried. Sometimes it was cremated, the ashes placed in a vessel, the vessel buried with intention. Sometimes it was returned to the earth quickly, with objects, with color, with direction. The specific form varied endlessly, but the core impulse was always the same. The body of someone who mattered could not simply be left. It had to be transformed. Passage had to be marked. And the marking was never silent. The archaeological record cannot give us sound. We cannot hear the songs or the wailing or the words spoken over the bodies at Kafse or Songhir. But we know from every documented human culture, and anthropologists have yet to find one that lacks mortuary ritual. That sound was part of it. Lamentation, story, the speaking of names. Researcher Ian Morley at the University of Oxford has argued that music and death have been entangled since the earliest emergence of symbolic behavior. The oldest known musical instruments in the archaeological record appear in the same period as the earliest evidence of complex burial. This is almost certainly not a coincidence. Your ancestors gathered. They made sounds together. They told the story of the person who had died. They named what had been lost. In doing so, they did something that no amount of modern therapy has been able to fully replace. They externalized grief. They made it communal. The weight that one person could not carry alone was distributed across the group. The story of the dead person, who they were, what they meant, what they left behind, was spoken out loud and received by people who nodded and wept and added their own memories. The dead person was not simply gone. They were present in the gathering, present in the naming, present for a moment in the sound. This is the thing that modern grief practices are slowly, clumsily trying to rediscover. The medicalization of grief, the idea that there is a correct timeline, a set of stages, a clinical endpoint, is extraordinarily new. Psychologist George Bonanno at Columbia University has challenged the standard grief models extensively, showing in his research that the trajectory of grief is far more varied and idiosyncratic than any stage model suggests. Some people recover faster than expected. Some people carry grief quietly for years without it ever becoming pathological. The presence or absence of visible distress does not predict long-term outcomes. What does seem to matter across the research is connection, the presence of other people, the permission to name the loss out loud, which is exactly what your ancestors were doing 130,000 years ago in a cave in Israel. They were not primitive. They were not performing empty superstition. They were solving a problem that every human community faces: the problem of how to absorb the loss of a member without losing the community itself. And the solution they found, refined across hundreds of thousands of years of trial and heartbreak, was to gather, to touch the body with care, to place something meaningful alongside it, to speak the name, to make the loss real and communal and witnessed. You still do versions of all of this: the funeral, the wake, the sitting Shiva, the gathering after, the stories told over food, the photographs passed around, the names spoken aloud in a room full of people who love the same person. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient technologies, worn smooth by hundreds of thousands of years of human hands. Someone you know is going to die. And when that moment comes, and you find yourself doing something, gathering, speaking, placing something meaningful alongside the memory, you are not just following a custom, you are participating in the oldest continuous human practice in existence. You are doing what your ancestors did in the dark of a cave, in the firelight of a camp, in the cold of a Russian winter, 34,000 years ago. You are refusing to let the loss be silent. You are saying the name. And in that act, however briefly, however imperfectly, you are keeping them present, just as every human who ever loved someone has done before you.